Thanks very much, Madam Chair. Thanks also to the laboratory for the kind invitation, and thanks again for the very kind openings words. I think we move from the US to Europe for the next 40 minutes or so, and indeed most of my reflections pertain to blasphemy and activist art. Now, the European Court of Human Rights and the gentleman who asked the question took some wind out of my sails by asking this question. But the European Court of Human Rights freedom of expression case law is very troublesome. I find is notoriously troublesome, perhaps, ever since one of the early landmark cases on freedom of expression, the Handyside case. The Strasbourg court has paid ample lip service to freedom of expression as a cornerstone of a democratic society. And specifically, it keeps referring to one particular formula, a mantra almost, holding that free speech protection is applicable not only to information or ideas that are, in our quote, favorably received and regarded as inoffensive or as a matter of indifference, but also to those that offend, shock, or disturb the state or any sector of the population. The quote continues then, such are the demands of pluralism, tolerance, and broad-mindedness, without which there is no democratic society, unquote. The reality is that ever since Handyside, in fact, including that very judgment in which the court distills insurmountable ethical objections from what essentially was a harmless sex education booklet, hardly ever do offensive, shocking, or disturbing statements trigger robust enough free speech protection by the highest European Human Rights Court. The upshot thereof is that the Strasbourg court at times fails to protect speech acts, protect especially those speech acts that are not favorably received. Popular and inoffensive speech acts, naturally, typically are not in a dire need of free speech protection, as societal or governmental threats to it are not likely. It is particularly then in the area of critical voices, minority opinions, opinions against the status quo, voices for change, voices against the establishment, voices against the normal, voices against the acceptable, voices against orthodoxy, voices against the orthodox, that others are bound to be offended, shocked, and outraged. And that is the area where freedom of expression is particularly valuable. Under the reigning jurisprudential approach to the European Convention on Human Rights, as adopted by the Strasbourg Court, there remains too little room for unorthodox voices, especially where such voices affect religious sensitivities. Notably, in the past, all too often, state parties to the European Convention got away with blasphemy restrictions on free speech, with restrictions aiming to protect the morals of the orthodox establishment, and other restrictions that may serve the protection of vaguely, if at all, defined feelings of the interest group. As such, the European Court of Human Rights was actually getting out of touch with both the United Nations and momentum happening within the UN and European state practice on blasphemy restrictions. United Nations independent rapporteurs on freedom of religion and on freedom of expression, as well as United Nations monitoring bodies, such as, importantly, the Human Rights Committee, which monitors the UN International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, have in their contributions, in their general comments, in their reports, expressly identified blasphemy laws as being contrary to UN standards, as being contrary in and for themselves to the ICCPR. The only religion-based exception here is the extraordinary circumstance of incitement to violence or incitement to discrimination on grounds of religion. Also, European states have largely decriminalized blasphemy, with some dormant laws and a few live laws being the exception to that rule. And it was the Strasbourg Court's 1990s case law that formed the original landmarks in this area and that dictated religious offense cases for many years to come. One of the points of this presentation shall be also that this is subject to change now, but I will get there at long last. Let's first continue my rant against the early case law. So this body of early blasphemy and blasphemous art cases is highly problematic from a free speech and a freedom of religion perspective. First and foremost, the Strasbourg Court used grounds to limit speech acts that are not recognized by the European Convention on Human Rights as legitimate aims, precisely the intervention this gentleman here made, i.e. grounds accepted by the Convention itself that may serve as goals on the basis of which the fundamental right to freedom of expression can be limited. Such important public goods may, under circumstances, override free speech, and are, according to the European Convention, these are the interests of national security, territorial integrity, public safety, the prevention of disorder or crime, for the protection of health and morals, for the protection of the reputation or rights of others, for preventing the disclosure of information received in confidence, or for maintaining the authority and impartiality of the judiciary. This is an exhaustive list. In its blasphemy jurisprudence, however, the Strasbourg Court identified time and again as an additional limiting ground the vaguely worded notion of religious feelings of others. Thus, in such cases as X and Y versus the UK, or the Gay News case, the Otto Preminger Institute versus Austria case, Wingrove versus the United Kingdom, and many others, the European Court of Human Rights concluded that the freedom of expression could legitimately be restricted in the interest of protecting the religious sensitivities of others. The development of such a right not to be insulted in one's religious feelings may be questioned. First of all, again, no such right is expressly enshrined in international human rights documents, neither as a right nor as a limitation ground. Nor, it's not codified in the International Bill of Rights, see Articles 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or Article 18 of the UN International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, nor in the European Convention on Human Rights. True, a right to freedom of religion or belief is codified by all the above human rights treaties, but this right does not include a right to be immune to religion-based criticism or ridicule. The right to freedom of religion or belief consists of two fundamental freedoms. First, the freedom to have or adopt a religion, including the freedom to change one's religion, or not to have a religion at all, or to adopt a non-religious belief, also referred to as the forum internum. According to international human rights instruments, that particular freedom is absolute. It's also defined in a very inclusive fashion, i.e. metaphysical beliefs, theistic beliefs, but also non-theistic or atheistic ways of life are all covered by the inner freedom. That would also make me then say, to also already start the debate, I would argue that freedom of religion or belief is not important because religion is important, but freedom of religion and belief is important because freedom is important. And this freedom also includes the prohibition against religious coercion. Under no circumstances under this inner freedom may the state hence interfere with the innermost aspect of actually having or adopting a religion or belief. Second, then, everyone has the right to manifest one's religion, or the forum externum. This external practicing aspect of the freedom entails the freedom to, either alone or in community with others, in public or private, manifest one's religion or belief in worship, teaching, practice, and observance. Now, two things are very striking in that regard. First, there's no express mention of yet a third freedom to never be insulted in one's religious feelings. And second, the freedom to manifest in any event is subject to limitations. Another important objection to the European Court's blasphemy jurisprudence is that even if the Strasbourg court would balance free speech with recognized rights of others, i.e. the freedom of expression balanced with the rights of others to freedom of religion or belief, rather than religious feelings, it typically does not take the necessity principle very seriously. The necessity test requires the court to assess whether it was all things considered absolutely pivotal to sacrifice free speech in the interest of the religious rights of others. Now, one glance at the early relevant jurisprudence shows that the European Court does not always apply such a rigorous test in its blasphemy case law. For instance, again, in the landmark Otto Preminger case, revolving around a movie which no doubt was blasphemous and which was screened at a local cinema, the Strasbourg court stated, and now I quote, and bear with me because this is a fairly long quote, "The Austrian courts, ordering the seizure and subsequently the forfeiture of the film, held it to be an abusive attack on the Roman Catholic religion according to the conception of the Tyrolean public. The court cannot disregard the fact that the Roman Catholic religion is the religion of the overwhelming majority of Tyroleans. In seizing the film, the Austrian authorities acted to ensure religious peace in that region and to prevent that some people should feel the object of attacks on their religious beliefs in an unwarranted manner." Now, this strike has extremely strong words for a case wherein the facts of the case give not the slightest glimpse of the religious peace being under any threat. Yes, the film amounts to a verbal attack on the church and on its doctrines, but it is appearing rather hypothetical at best and far-fetched at worst to read into this scenario a risk that the Tyroleans were about to take up arms to underscore their outrage. And in fact, even if they did, the importance of freedom of expression is such that in such a scenario, the onus is upon the state to, in principle, seek ways to nonetheless protect the Speech Act. There would be a positive obligation to protect the filmmakers, the cinema, the audience interested in this screening. And only if public order issues would become so dire that the state could not possibly guarantee peace and order would the state have a clearer cut, not a clear cut, but a clearer cut case in favor of limiting that most democratic of rights, free speech. None of that was at stake in this case, nor indeed in many, virtually all, I would say, blasphemy cases that followed the Otto Preminger Institute's lead. Also, the religious rights of the Tyroleans were never at stake. The Strasbourg court itself actually more than hints at this by underscoring this demographical fact. The overwhelming majority, the court keeps hinting, the overwhelming majority of locals adhered to the religion under verbal attack. In that particular light then, it's rather unlikely that they were so vulnerable that they were already subject to historical, official or societal abuse, or that hate crimes were already perpetrated. Indeed, that it was likely that the movie would then be fuel to fire. Quite the contrary. There was a strong, dominant religious minority. Then there was a blasphemous movie that some found interesting, others found not, whether they actually saw it or only heard about it. And subsequently, there remained a strong, dominant religious majority perfectly able to exercise their religious freedom rights. Mobilizing the protection of the religious peace as a legal argument to restrict free speech under such circumstances and in such a context is not sound and is not convincing. It is actually a frame to pretend that there is a conflict of rights occurring in which rights then need to be balanced, but in actual fact there is no clash of rights here. There's only diversity of values and opinions. The freedom of religion is not engaged by each and every insulting or critical speech act, but only if the specific and recognized freedoms of having or manifesting a religion are undermined or at imminent risk. For that to happen requires extreme scenarios. It requires, again, incitement to lawless action or incitement to violence, incitement to discrimination, and a number of other extraordinary scenarios. And even then, whenever the religious rights of others are truly engaged, the burden of proof is to substantiate that it is necessary in democratic society to actually sacrifice free speech so as to protect those religious rights that are at stake. And this onus lies squarely upon the state. I take a jump in a number of blasphemy cases, and I jump to 2005 now, to the case of IA versus Turkey, a split 4-3 decision. And in their dissenting opinions, Judges Costa, Cabral, Barreto, and Jungwirth lamented that the time has perhaps come to revisit this case law, I'm quoting now, which in our view, though these three dissenting judges, seems to place too much emphasis on conformism or uniformity of thought and to reflect an overcautious and timid conception of freedom of the press. And I would argue that in a sense, the IA case itself started the revision process that I want to draw out a bit further now. To this case, IA concerned Abdullah Riza's Erguven's book. I will not butcher the Turkish title, I will give the translated title, The Forbidden Phrases, which conveys, and now I quote from the judgment, the author's views on philosophical and theological issues in a novelistic style, unquote. So, and more particularly, the case then deals with Turkey's penalizing him, the author, over it, initially by sentencing him to 2 years imprisonment, a penalty later commuted into a fine only. Now, the Turkish judiciary referred specifically to a couple of book excerpts in its judgment. And now I quote, "Look at the triangle of fear, inequality, and inconsistency in the Quran. It reminds me of an earthworm. God says that all the words are those of his messenger." And then the quote moves on to offending the messenger in a number of ways. The Strasbourg court considered that the issue before the court involves the weighing up of the conflicting interest of the exercise of two fundamental freedoms, namely the right of the applicant to impart to the public his views on religious doctrine on the one hand, and the rights of others to respect for their freedom of thought, conscience, and religion on the other. Now this seemingly obvious consideration was a first major revision of the Otto Preminger doctrine, in as much as this is the very first case on blasphemous matter in which the Strasbourg court gets the balancing of rights correctly, at least on paper, balance free speech with religious freedoms rather than free speech with my earlier criticized notion of religious sensitivities. That is not to say that the majority in IA got it right. It did not. While fixing its scale, so to speak, the very balancing exercise itself remains highly questionable. Specifically, the Strasbourg court accepted all too uncritically that it was necessary to interfere with free speech for the sake of upholding religious freedoms. At no point in the judgment does the court satisfactorily explain how the rights of others to freedom of religion or belief actually came into play in this particular case, or how the two rights, free speech and freedom of religion, conflicted in the first place in this particular case. Sorry. At no point did the European courts explicate how the blasphemous act in question could affect people's freedom to have their religion and to manifest their religion or belief. Both the Turkish authorities and also the European Court on Human Rights exclusively focused on content, altogether omitting a proper context assessment. The Strasbourg court failed to address the question of likelihood of harm to the religious rights of others, and indeed this likelihood, this risk, potential risk, was severely challenged by the three dissenters. And now I quote, "The evidence before the court does not indicate how many people actually read the novel, but the number is probably small, as it is suggested by the fact that the book was never reprinted. Moreover, the limited practical impact on society of the author's statement was not taken into account by the national authorities, which confined themselves to an abstract assessment of the statement, which were made, as had been noted, in a novelistic style." Now, in 2018, I would now next argue in a 2018 judgment, I think we saw a further reversal or revisiting of the Otto Preminger doctrine to blasphemy cases. In this 2018 judgment, Maria Alekina and others versus Russia, the European Court of Human Rights went considerably further. This case, I would argue, forms a transition from a focus on, or preoccupation even, on religious sensitivities to a focus on incitement to hatred, and spelling out that religious provocation, even if blasphemous, is firmly protected by human rights law. Amply drawing on recent benchmarking exercises by other international monitoring bodies and independent human rights experts, the Strasbourg Court underscored such crucial premises as these. First and foremost, now I quote, restrictions on such freedom in the form of criminal sanctions are only acceptable in cases of incitement to hatred. This is the first time the European Court formulated that particular benchmark, that particular yardstick. And clearly the threshold is infinitely higher compared to the religious sensitivities threshold. Also, the need for a context-specific approach, and this is the court's term, a context-specific approach is underscored, especially by highlighting, and now I quote, the interplay between the various factors involved rather than any of them taken in isolation to determine the outcome of a case. And amongst us context factors then are mentioned the context in which the speech concerned is being used, the capacity of the person using the speech to exercise influence over others, third, the nature and strength of the language used, fourth, the context of specific remarks, fifth, the medium used, and sixth, the nature of the audience. These context factors, they resemble quite strongly the momentum I hinted at earlier within the United Nations, where among other benchmarks like the Rabat Plan of Action on incitement and a number of Article 19, the NGO Article 19's documents have found their way, have been incorporated into the benchmarking machine, so to speak, of the United Nations by rubber stamping them by the Human Rights Committee and a number of independent experts. Now, so this case makes the European Court's approach resemble the UN approach to the same. The performance of the punk prayer, which is underlying this case, the punk prayer, which was deemed hooliganism by Russia, in the conclusion of the court, does not in any way whatsoever amount to punishable speech act within the meaning of international standards. Specifically, while it may be deemed an act of provocation, it is not an act of illegal incitement. The importance between the two concepts is one between, say, a more objective and a more subjective approach. The difference between the two concepts is that whereas an act of incitement aims to mobilize a third party to commit acts of violence or discrimination aimed at the verbally targeted group, an act of provocation aims at provoking a reaction, shock, or outrage, or insult by the targeted group, directly by the targeted group itself. So the difference is a triangular pattern, a triangular relation of mobilization of violence versus a more bilateral relation where the target group itself acts outraged. So Pussy Riot very successfully provoked, clearly, yet Pussy Riot did not incite. And underlying the rationale in Pussy Riot's work, one may also read this. It's when worldly leaders work in tandem with the religious ones to undermine minority rights, the right to provoke might actually become a duty. It could even become a sacred duty, because a close reading of the punk prayer lyrics unveils a profound theological feminism, a religiously inspired duty to protect the separation between state and church, to protect minority rights, to protect against discrimination of persons on grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity, and indeed to protect the fundamental right to freedom of speech, including religious speech. So legally, I would like to conclude my paper. Legally, I would argue there's no such thing as a cultural threat to religious freedom. Yes, there might be a cultural threat to identity, but not to the fundamental right to religious freedom. So I would also argue that individualism in this area is an exercise of freedom. It's not a threat, and it's also not a cause for conflict of rights. The frame of conflicting rights here then, I would argue and conclude, is best replaced with the potential of diversity. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. The topic that you have presented is something that here in the Laboratory of Religious Freedom we see almost every day, that we receive information about different cases of blasphemies or victims who feel that they really they have been non-protected on their expression, or on the opposite side, they have been hurt on their religious identity. So this is something that we see, this tension between Article 9, Article 10, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, that is very, this is a very difficult thing. And so thank you very much for your lecture. And well, we are going to give place to questions. So maybe the question that you were asking, the last one, Dr. Jakuszewicz, you were asking a question regarding the European Court of Justice. You may want to reframe.
Yes, Professor, I agree that there is no legal right to have one's feelings protected derived from freedom of religion. But I would argue that European Court of Human Rights extends all the rights very widely. They are like, sometimes I think, they are like wizards which create new rights for ex nihilo, which are not written down in the convention. And if we go that path, I would argue that as a scholar, I don't like deriving, I'm very unwillingly deriving right to have one's feelings protected from Article 9, but given the broader context, of the interpretation adopted by Strasbourg Court, I would, in practice, go that way. So, as a scholar, I told that there is no right to have one's feelings protected. But if I were advocating, or defending religious people, I would go that way, as Preminga case. But on the other hand, I would ask you, would you go another way? Would you try to limit freedom of expression on the grounds of public morals, at least in some countries, to have religious feelings protected? I would go that way. For example, in Poland or in some countries, deeply religious countries, where it is just immoral to express blasphemy, and freedom of expression should be restricted because of morals. What do you think?
Thanks for that question. Yeah, so first of all, it's true that the European Court has extended many of the terms in its jurisprudence, including this one, has read terms into other terms, or has simply extended the definitions. In this particular case, also for the reasons I gave earlier, I would argue that it would be unwise to do so, because that would create a situation where there's a perpetual conflict between Article 9 and Article 10, free speech, 10, and freedom of religion. So if religious sensitivities were to be read into the freedom clauses or the limitation clauses, for that matter, there simply is a perpetual clash. Anytime anyone says anything remotely critical or insulting to religion, we end up with a clash. And when we have a clash, the court must start balancing, so start sacrificing freedom in the interest of promoting the other freedom. So I think this is a scenario to avoid, and it can simply be avoided by having a more stringent reading of the terms of the treaty. Also, there's another layer to this, which is by looking not introspectively at Europe, but also to other parts of the world, and that's the public diplomacy angle to this debate. Causing religious offense is an exercise of freedom of religion. This sounds very, very blunt, but it is the case for, say, the Baha'is, the Ahmadiyas. Ahmadiyas are persecuted because they are considered an offshoot of Islam. They are considered blasphemous or heretical because they do not, as one of their religious tenets, believe that Muhammad was the seal of the prophets, right? Was the very last prophet in line. This very doctrine is heretical, can be deemed blasphemous. So by exercising this religious tenet, it causes automatic and in and for itself religious offense, and can be deemed heretical and blasphemous. If we go down the line of anti-blasphemy regulation, it is these kind of minority religious beliefs we're also essentially criminalizing. Then, and now I make the bridge to the public morals exception. Then you could argue, well, but that's a very different scenario from the one where someone is gratuitous. This is a word I can never pronounce. Is very deliberately being offensive and provocative, because that's not necessarily a free exercise of religion. I would still there argue it can be still a freedom of opinion and freedom of expression, but I would agree that's not necessarily in and of itself an exercise of religious freedom, although religious freedom also pertains to the non-religious. However, again, if we would there read or extend the public morals exception to the level of religious sensitivities, there are a couple of alarm bells going off in my head. One is the one that's already codified by the UN Human Rights Committee, which says morals should never be usurped by one particular, by the dominant religion, to basically define or hijack what is what amounts to morals. And of course, there's this risk. There's this risk that then would be the case if we equate morals with religious sensitivities, then thus contributing to the same risk of persecution of religious minorities. And then there's a final argument against that line, which I hinted at in the paper, which is the subjective to the objective approach to extreme speech. I would not disagree with the statement that also blasphemous speech can be extreme, but still the anti-incitement strategy has as its major benefit, I would say, as a major potential, that you can focus on the likelihood of harm being done to the targeted group, right? So this is this triangle that I was drawing before. You can objectively make a risk assessment about the different relationships in the triangle, particularly how draconian, how threatening was the speech act made. So that's the relationship between the inciter or the extreme speaker and the targeted group, but also in the relationship between the speaker and the target group, how, to what extent is the group really dehumanized or not? Now, and you can also focus on intent matters there in the relationship between the speaker and again the audience. So indeed, was there a question of incitement? Was the audience incited to become violent or to act in a discriminatory manner? So these are more or less objective questions that you can ask about these relations. And then the third relation is the relation, of course, between the audience and the targeted group. And that is how, upon the speech act, upon publication, upon the presentation, how likely is it that the audience will engage in harmful acts, in adverse acts, vis-a-vis the targeted group. Now, all of these matters can be more or less objectively scrutinized, at least more objectively than this bilateral relationship between speaker and offendee, if you will, right? That's very much in the eye or in the ear of the offendee, but also that if that would become the legal regime, offense may be overstated, may be orchestrated, and free speech could be hijacked, could be hijacked by overstating and over-orchestrating offense on the part of the targeted group, thus then hijacking free speech, even anywhere in the world, in our global online world of today. Sorry, very long answer.
Thank you, please, Fernando. Yes. Yeah, we don't have time.
Thank you very much for the lecture, and well, I want to cast some doubt on the criterion of incitement to violence. Well, I'll speak also about this topic of my lecture a little bit, but I think that the criterion of incitement to violence, or the likelihood of the speech to provoke violence, or the auditorium to be incited to violence, is pretty dangerous. I think public peace is not what should be protected by punishing or by punishing blasphemy or religious offense, but the honor of the offended. That's what really matters. Because public peace depends also on the willingness of a particular group to be violent. And that's pretty discriminatory. There are certain religious groups that they are very likely to react with violence. There are other religious groups who are more prompt to put the other chin, how do you say, to suffer. So public peace, I think public peace is on the reverse of the acts with which a society makes itself worthy of public peace. But what really matters is the common good, so to speak. So there is an inversion of teleology in that sense. There is an inversion of teleology when we put public peace. And that's what the European Court of Human Rights is doing. Not only the European Court of Human Rights, also in Germany, for example, the crime of religious blasphemy only punishes blasphemy when it creates or when it is likely to provoke violence. Well, clearly, that's extremely discriminatory, in my view. And, well, I don't want to mention particular groups, but it's not very difficult to imagine which groups are more likely to be violent. Whereas other groups who are peaceful groups are continually attacked, are continually humiliated with total immunity on the side of the offenders. So I think that's the wrong approach of the European Court of Human Rights, not only, generally of the West. I mean, this idea of public peace, I mean, is the honor of the offended. That doesn't mean that we are protecting extreme subjectivities or extreme sensibilities. We cannot solve this problem without a value judgment on the difference between an excessive sensibility and a legitimate sensibility towards offense. We need value judgments. We cannot avoid these by saying, no, public peace, because public peace provides us with an objective fact. Yes, it's an objective fact, it's the likelihood of a group to be aggressive, but that's not the right objective fact that we are looking for. That leads to a totalitarian state in which violent groups take over the state. We cannot avoid these with value judgments, that's the problem. And that's what the European Court of Human Rights tries to do when it displaces the honor of the offended that can only be assessed through a value judgment by positive factual issues or things like likelihood to provoke violence. So that's my, well, I mean, it's not a criticism on your presentation, but on the whole approach of the European Court of Human Rights, and not only the European Court of Human Rights. But
yeah, thanks for the comment. Let me start by putting the European approach into perspective, because I would take issue with this being called the Western approach. It's the global approach. The European Court is actually last to close its ranks with the United Nations and to have its approach reconciled with the United Nations approach, specifically Article 20 of the ICCPR, 170 plus state parties, with a handful of reservations, including the United States, to Article 20, not because incitement is the wrong approach, but because under the First Amendment, the threshold is even higher than right under the Brandenburg and the incitement to lawless action exception is even higher than what is stated under Article 20. So not more generous, no, an even higher limitation. So I would argue this is not the Western approach, it's the global approach. There's also Article 4 of ICER, so the International Convention on Racial Discrimination, with even more ratifications and also containing the incitement limit to free speech. So I think that one of the points of the paper is that at long last the European Court is joining the UN on this anti-incitement path. I think why it took the European Court so long is because there's no incitement clause in the European Convention. There's only an abuse of rights clause. So unlike the UN instruments, there is no specific extreme speech or hate speech clause. But seeing the momentum, because also Article 20 and Article 4 have been ignored for decades and have been seen as those very obvious post-Holocaust instruments that and very much focused on states' mobilization of hatred against minority. But it's after the various free speech rows, Rushdie, and then much later the Danish cartoons, where the pendulum was swaying, was within the political bodies of the UN swaying in favor of very generous limitations to free speech. That was the moment where the independent experts in the United Nations monitoring bodies started seizing the incitement clauses to start benchmarking and creating yardsticks and conceptualizing this as a very limited limit on free speech. Now I completely agree with you on that it can be biased incitement approaches. Going on the anti-incitement route instead of the anti-blasphemy route is not a guarantee for rights being implemented or guaranteed in the best fashion, because this very much requires at the domestic level, because all these international incitement clauses require domestic implementation, require very strict, stringent implementation laws, and also, of course, also judiciary that renders them in a fashion to protect free speech and its limits correctly. Now, and that's where I think that's where we differ then on momentum, like the rabbit plan of action, which I see as very strong benchmarks there. I see all this filling in of context factors on the part of the speaker, the influence of the Speech Act, the nature of the audience, all such context and risk factors that can be checked as a very strong addition to this debate. So I think I leave it at that. Thanks.
Any other question? Yes, please.
Just say a few words. Przemysław Komorowski, Laboratory of Religious Freedom. Well, I just wanted to say that when we have two fundamental rights, like freedom of religion and freedom of expression, the balancing, weighting the rights is inevitable from my perspective. But I wanted to ask, because I'm not maybe as a scholar aware of the situation, although I have some hints that it might be like that going from respecting of religious feelings to incitement, I mean the shifting the way of the perspective of the European Court of Human Rights this way, let's say it so, it's not going in the same direction when we think of the other rights connected with the identity of person. I mean, for example, sexual orientation, I mean some kind of national hatred speeches like anti-Semitism. Maybe you are aware of that kind of situation, because I believe taking into seeing or looking at the national, not only in Poland but in several European countries, on national law, national judicial activities, that kind of identities are broadening. I mean, the protection of that kind of identities are protected even broader year by year. In the same time, the religious identity is becoming protected less. Thank you.
Good question. So I think I can situate your question within the context of the European equivalent of some of the cases the previous speaker was engaging before the U.S. High Court and Supreme Court, and I would not completely agree with your differentiation between these two. So, like on religious exemptions and within the corporate sphere or within religious schools, I essentially see the European courts struggling there, and I get mixed messages, I would, for the time being, and this is a very academic and almost political answer to this, I would say that these cases seem to turn not so much on a deep, comprehensive vision on the part of the European Court, but on a technical reading of the domestic cases, and particularly the question as to whether the domestic judiciary has made a fair balance of the rights at stake. And then the court, applying its famous margin of appreciation, sways either way. And so the outcomes I find confusing when I read court summaries because I get mixed messages, and sometimes, yes, the court seem to go all exemptions, and sometimes the court seems to be very tough on exemption. But they're, for the time being, my reading is it doesn't seem to be leaning on a very profound agenda there, but rather on the margin of appreciation and what happens locally. So, yeah, sorry for the sort of very academic, balanced answer there.
Okay, so if there's no more question, we would go now, yes, to the coffee break, and we'll be back at 12:15. Thank you very much.